Great, thank you, everyone. So apologies for the slight delay letting everyone in. We just had a few technical difficulties, which we've now resolved. My name's Ben Toulson. I'm one of the committee members for the Cornwall Science Community. And thank you all for coming back to the Cafe Sci. It's nice to see some of the regular names turning up and some new ones as well. So yeah, really nice to see everyone. This is another online talk. We're hoping to do, we've got some more events coming up before Christmas. We're hoping to do a few in-person, potentially as hybrid events as well in the future. But anyway, on to this evening. As you all hopefully know, we've got Hilary Mitchell with us today to talk about Cornish Choughs. And Hilary has been working with Choughs, I think this is right, since 2013 with the RSPB, National Trust, and now looks after the Cornish Chough database for Cornwall Birds as well. So that's enough from me. Over to you, Hilary.
Right. So, as Ben very kindly said, I've been a Chough volunteer since 2013. I'm also joint editor of the Cornwall Bird Report. So most of what I do for that is with CBWPS or Cornwall Birds, but I spend a lot of my volunteering time with RSPB or National Trust on the Choughs. 2022 is a very exciting year. We are celebrating 20 years of breeding Cornish Choughs. We were going to celebrate 20 years of Cornish Choughs returning last year, but COVID got in the way. So what am I going to look at tonight? I'm going to start off with a bit of history. So looking at how our Choughs came to decline, then how they came to return. I'll talk a little bit about the Cornish Chough Conservation Network and the work that is done to monitor and protect choughs. I'll cover a little bit on rings, nests and habitat, and finish up with talking about how our choughs have actually done this year. So a few facts to get us started. Chough are members of the crow family. They're the only crow in the UK that has the distinctive red legs and red bill. If you know the call, it makes it a lot easier to find them. It's very distinctive. Hopefully you'll hear them when you're out on the cliffs. They're very intelligent birds. They're superb flyers. They like to think they can outfly pretty much anything, and that includes peregrines, which is not always the best idea. They pair for life usually. We have seen pairs break up, and they are long-lived birds. The oldest bird I know of was a bird in Wales who was ringed, and he was still breeding age 21. The bird in the picture is our oldest male. This photo was taken in spring this year when he was 17, and he looked pretty magnificent despite being that old. Where we find chough, well, in the British Isles, they're a bird of western coasts. They are found in Cornwall, West Wales, Isle of Man, a very small and declining population on Islay in Scotland, and the western coast of Ireland. Elsewhere in the world, I've seen chough in Spain, in the Pyrenees, and down on the plain. In the Atlas Mountains, which is the North African green blob that you can see, and also at 12,000 feet in the Tian Shan Mountains in Kazakhstan. So they're a bird of mountains and plains, mainly elsewhere in the world. They're obviously the Cornish national bird on the Cornwall coat of arms, on the arms of West Penwith, and heavily connected with the legend of King Arthur. But despite all of that, they were in steep decline. Now, I hate to mention the P word, but Poldark, the very first book was set in, I believe, 1781. At that time, chough were already in steep decline in the county. So hopefully that puts it in historical context. They were treated as an agricultural pest. Not sure why, but they were. The main reason that they went extinct was habitat change. The cliffs used to be grazed by animals, and during that period, the beasts got moved off the cliff further inland, and the cliffs were allowed to scrub over. And that really was the main reason why we started to lose them. Once they became rare, of course, they were then an even bigger target for egg collectors and trophy collectors. Certainly the Victorians never regarded a bird as properly watched until it was shot, stuffed, and in a glass case. Any small population, declining population, is at risk of extinction, and the choughs were no different. By the mid-1800s, we no longer had birds nesting in the south of Cornwall or on lizard. It took until 1910 for most of the north coast birds to disappear. The last known successful breeding in the county was in 1947. By 1967, we had one pair left near Newquay, and one of those birds died in 67, and the other one lingered on till 73, at which point our chough were extinct. We had a few sightings of random birds from 1973 onwards, but they never stayed. But in 2001, we had 3 birds turn up on lizard. It's important to stress this was not a reintroduction. These were wild birds who turned up of their own accord. DNA analysis later proved that they had come from Ireland. At the time, you probably remember, early 2001, we were in the throes of the foot and mouth epidemic. What that meant for the chough was that the cliffs had no visitors. Paths were closed, no one was on the cliffs, so they could come and they could settle in completely undisturbed. There were just a few local bird watchers who knew they were there. In 2001, 2 of the 3 birds paired. They found a nest site, a suitable nest site. And because they'd done that and they were looking like they were going to stay, it generated huge interest and a massive conservation effort to protect them. And the RSPB Chough project was born to make sure the choughs got the protection they needed so that they could breed successfully if that's what they were going to do. The site they chose, as probably everybody knows, was at Lizard Point, Southerly Point, Polpier Cove, which at the time was absolutely perfect for them because the National Trust had got some rather splendid Highland cows on the cliffs doing conservation grazing. They were trying to reduce scrub and improve wildflowers and just biodiversity generally, but it meant that it was absolutely perfect for the chough when they arrived. But it is a busy place. Once the foot and mouth restrictions were lifted, it was going to be full of visitors. And for that reason, and the fact that, you know, Cornish Chough, the return of the Cornish Chough was such an amazing thing, generated so much interest. And the birds were then at risk from disturbance and egg collectors. They were watched. There was a huge volunteer effort. There were 2 watch points set up. The nearest one to us where the light is you can see is on the old lifeboat house. And then the further one is across on the cliffs near Pistol Meadow. The nest was watched 24/7. There were around 60 volunteers, plus RSPB staff who mainly covered the night shifts. Thousands of hours of volunteer effort over the first few years to protect the birds, make sure they were safe. And in 2002, this happened. We had the first chicks fledge in Cornwall for more than 50 years. The pair fledged 3 chicks, and it's a huge testament to the efforts the volunteers put in protecting them and their nest, that they were successful. And that's why in 2022 we're celebrating 20 years of breeding Cornish Chough. And this is a picture of some of that team of volunteers. The lady standing behind the cake with the RSPB badge on her fleece is Claire Mucklow. She was the manager of the RSPB Chough project and did a huge amount of work, not just protecting the birds at Lizard, but later, you know, we'll see the sheer amount of work involved with landowners to make sure the habitat was right. And then with her are some of the volunteers who did those 4-hour shifts on the Cornish cliffs in all weathers to make sure the birds were safe. But recolonisation takes time. So we had success in 2002 with the lizard pair breeding and fledging 3 chicks. It took until 2006 before we had a second nest. If you remember, there were 3 birds that arrived. The third bird was a female, and she had to wait until one of the male offspring of the first pair was old enough and survived long enough to pair with her. So we had 2 nests in 2006. They were both watched 24/7. And that second nest also fledged 3 birds in 2006. By 2008, we had 3 breeding pairs. We had a pair back in West Penwith, and we had an all-male pair. 2008, as I say, saw the first West Penwith nest, and that was the first for over 150 years. It took until 2010 before Newquay was recolonised, and it was 2012 before those birds actually produced any chicks. So where are we now? Well, Lizard remains home of chough. There has been a breeding pair of chough at Lizard, although in a different site, every year since 2002. 2015 marked a big turning point. From then on, we have seen an increase in the number of pairs attempting to breed each year. 2018 saw further recolonisation of the North Coast, with a pair coming into Perranporth and settling there. 2019 saw St Agnes repopulated with chough, and there's now several pairs in that area. It's a good place if you want to see chough. We now have chough spread as far along the North Coast as Trevose. They're established, and we're getting regular sightings of birds across the Camel. So that's looking good, hopefully for next year and the year after, that they'll continue to spread up the North Coast. 2019 was another major event, in that year the RSPB's Chough project came to an end, and the Cornish Chough Conservation Network was established. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically the network now has the role of monitoring and protecting the chough. So in 2022, you can find chough along much of the Cornish coast. The sort of southern coast east of Lizard doesn't really have many birds, and the far northwest hasn't yet been populated. But we have had birds. We currently have birds near Bude. There are around 5 in South Devon at the moment, and we've had sightings in Dorset this year. So hopefully in the next few years, we'll see them spread even further. During this time, there's been quite a lot of comings and goings. We lost the pioneer pair at Lizard in 2013. There was a young male that was hanging around. It was breeding season, and he'd been there since they started, their nest building and their breeding. And then one day, while the original pair were feeding chicks in the nest, he and the male fought. They fought all day, watched by some pretty horrified volunteers, because we didn't have that many chough in 2013. And the next morning, there was no sign of the original male. The female hung around for about another week, and then she too disappeared. And astonishingly, that young male fed those chicks and he fledged them. That is really rare. Normally in that situation, he would let them die or he would actually kill them. So there's much speculation that he had actually mated with the female, and there was a possibility that they could have been his. We lost our third pioneer bird, the female from the second nest, sometime over the winter of 07-08. Don't know what happened to her. We had a ringed French bird. That's how we know where he was from. He turned up at Godrevy for a few days. Unfortunately, at the time, our population wasn't that big, so he didn't stay. I think if he turned up now, he might well do. Godrevy is a very good place to see chough. We've had a couple of new birds that we know of, both unringed. The first one was 2014. At the time, we had 3 unringed birds in the county from a nest that was not accessible. to the ringer, which is why they were unringed. And there was one day when volunteers counted 4 unringed birds. So one of those was new. And we think it was a female that arrived and bred. And we think we had another one in 2016, and that bird might be the current lizard female. But we've now got a lot of unringed birds. Every single bird that I know of along the north coast, which is Goodreevy through to Trevose, is unringed. You'll only find ring birds on Lizard or in West Penwith. So if we have got any incomers, birds from Wales or Ireland or even France, we can't really tell. So the Cornish Chough Conservation Network, as I said, this took over Chough Conservation when the RSPB's project came to an end in 2019. It's a partnership between the RSPB, the National Trust, and CBWPS, Cornwall Birds. So Cornwall Birds collects the sightings. There is a choughs@cbwps.org.uk email that I look after. So any chough sightings that get sent into that, I know about. And those sightings are incredibly useful in allowing us to see where birds are. And in breeding season, we can locate nests. We know where the pairs are, and we can send volunteers out to go and find the nests. This is important because all our chough nests are monitored. The RSPB and the National Trust have teams of volunteers. Around 60% of our nest sites currently are on National Trust land. So those ones are monitored by National Trust volunteers, and anything else is looked after by the RSPB. Any nests that are considered vulnerable have nest protection in place through volunteers. And all of that work means that we can gather information on breeding success. We can look at the behaviours the birds are showing during breeding season, and we can count the chicks that fledge. So there is a huge amount of volunteer effort still on nest monitoring and safeguarding. Just because we now have lots of chough doesn't mean that we leave them to do their own thing. We don't watch nests 24/7 anymore, just because we have so many. So the monitoring is straightforward. It's volunteers looking at the nests. What are the birds doing? Are they doing what we think they should be doing given the stage in the breeding? Does the female look like she's incubating? Are the parents coming in and out and feeding chicks? And obviously it lets you work out roughly when you think the chicks might fledge, so you can be there and count them when they do. But chough are a Schedule 1 species. They're legally protected. All of our nests have a risk assessment done. The biggest risk generally is disturbance. If they're close to a busy path where you might have a lot of visitors, then those nests will be safeguarded by volunteers to reduce disturbance. And, there's other actions that can be taken. So, the site can be roped off, signs put up. There are some nests that are on climbing routes, and for those nests, climbing restrictions are put in place. But egg collectors are still a threat. We know that. I've been told that birds in Wales lose 2 or 3 clutches a year still. So we're not complacent that risk has gone. And the other risk that the birds face comes when they fledge their chicks, because newly fledged chicks can't fly that well. They can usually take off, but their landings are more like a controlled crash. If they get separated from their parents, then they could be picked off by crows or ravens. So that's probably the last kind of big risk that we have, is that first week after fledging when the chicks are vulnerable. Talk a little now about rings, nests and habitat. So colour ringing, I know, is a bit of a controversial subject, but when the chough returned, the RSPB made the decision that they were going to ring all the chicks. And this was so that Cornish birds could be identified. Each bird wears a unique combination. And this decision was informed by the success of a Welsh ringing programme. We know chough go long distances. Our original 3 had come from Ireland after all. So it was felt really important that if Cornish birds spread out, either around the county or even ended up in Wales or back in Ireland, then we needed to know that they were Cornish. So from 2008, most of our ring birds wore St. Piran, so black and white stripes on one leg, along with the BTO metal ring that carries a unique number. And they wear 2 colour rings on the other leg. And the 2 colour rings and the leg they're on are unique. That's what identifies the individual bird. But our population grew, and chough like, well, difficult nest sites. So even with an intrepid ringer who's a member of the cliff rescue team, there were nests that he couldn't get into to ring the chicks. So as the population grew, so did our number of unringed birds. And in 2019, our population had reached about 100 birds. And we made the decision at the end of 2019 that we were not going to ring in 2020 or going forward, because the conservation necessity had reduced so much. If the population starts to fall, that decision will be revisited, or if there is a scientific project, then it would be revisited. But for now, we don't feel the same conservation need is there, so we're not ringing. And in fact, COVID would have prevented ringing in 2020 because it would have needed to happen in May, and we were all in lockdown at that point. So we have lots of unringed birds now. And this rather prehistoric looking chap, he fledged in 2011 from a nest in West Penwith. One of the other reasons that ringing has become more difficult is that the chicks are ringed when they're big enough to be measured and to be ringed, but not so big that they can actually fly. That means you have a very limited window of opportunity for the ringer to go in and actually ring the chicks. And you have to know precisely when that is, which means you have to have volunteers watching the nest pretty intensively to tell you what stage the birds are at. You need to know exactly when those chicks have hatched, and then you can work it out. With having so many nests now, that's just not possible. We cannot monitor. We don't have the volunteers to monitor that intensively. It was easy when we had half a dozen nests, but it's not now. So that was another good reason for not ringing birds in the future. But hopefully, as you can see, he wears orange over lime on his right leg, which identifies him as an individual. You can just about see his BTO metal ring, which has a unique number on it. And just behind that, you can see his black and white St. Piran ring, which marks him as Cornish. This bird is still alive. He has a nest site, holds territory near St. Just in West Penwith. And he is paired with one of our 2 oldest females. She fledged in 2009. He is, I have to say, rather more handsome looking now. So in terms of nesting, it's amazing that chough are going back to traditional sites that are recorded birds being in hundreds of years ago. So if near you have a site on the cliffs that has chough in its name, it's worth looking for them. How they know, I don't know, but they are going back to places where they used to be. Since 2002, we've seen 415 chicks fledge in Cornwall. It took us from 2002 till 2013 to reach our first 100 chicks milestone. So that was quite a long time, but it only took about 5 years for the next 100 chicks to fledge. So we nearly had 200 out by 2018. And 2021 and 22 combined have added over 130 chicks. That's exponential growth. And Cornwall's mining heritage is providing a lot of good sites for our birds. They don't nest in the open, they like to nest inside things. So mine shafts, mine adits, engine houses, sea caves, natural cracks in the granite. They're all used by birds. So I would say that if you are out on the cliffs from February through to June and you see chough perched on an engine house or going in and out of a hole in the cliff, please don't take photographs and put it on social media, because it could easily be a nest site. Please send me the sightings on the choughs at CBWPS email, because it might be a nest site that we don't know about. And finally, I said habitat was absolutely crucial. It was the main reason they went extinct in the first place. Chough need two things. They need short crop grass or heath, and it needs to be about 300 metres from a good nest site. They're not carrion eaters or predators like crows and ravens. They feed on larvae like leatherjackets, insects. They'll raid ants' nests for the grubs. They will eat grain in winter, and they have been known to eat cake occasionally. They're not daft. If people are putting food out, they'll work it out. So the grazing of the cliffs, the conservation grazing, is absolutely crucial in providing this habitat. And Claire Mucklow from the RSPB in the early days of the Chough project put a huge amount of work in alongside landowners, land managers, farmers, to make sure that habitat could be there for the chough to expand into. It had a huge effect. The National Trust are quite a big landowner of a lot of the coast, Cornish coast, and they've worked really hard to reintroduce this traditional grazing on the cliffs. They've just received 28 more ponies in West Cornwall, which they will put on the cliffs to graze them. And the other thing the National Trust do is they ban the use of ivermectin worming agents. These are highly effective worming agents, but they go straight through the cow and out the other side into the cowpat. Any insect that lands on that cowpat will die. So the cowpats are sterile. They don't support any invertebrates. And obviously, once they do decay into the ground, then the insecticide lingers. Research has shown that on National Trust land where they've done this, that not only do they have increased invertebrate populations, but they also have more bats, things that rely on invertebrates to live. And this is a good example. These are the Highland cows that were on the cliffs at Lizard when the choughs came back. And, it's perfect. You've got short cropped grass and cowpats full of insect life for the choughs to pick through. This is the kind of thing they like, short crop grass. This is Nanquidno Valley, which is grazed by longhorns. These two birds are the male pair that I mentioned earlier. And they were together for 7 years before a very determined female, our oldest currently, who'd lost her original mate, decided that she wanted one of these two males as her new mate, and she broke their pair bond. The male at the back has got a very nice juicy leather jacket. You've seen him before. He was on that very first slide. He's our oldest bird, now 17, and the male nearest to us is 16, and he is still with that very determined female. So, 2022. Well, as I've said, they're spreading out, they're expanding their range. You can find chough on much of the Cornish coast now. We've seen a huge increase in the North Coast population, so that's from Godrevy through to Trevose, and they are starting to go across the Camel and head up towards the Devon border. We've got more than one resident pair on Lizard now. We had just one on Lizard for a very long time, but now there's several. West Penwith was the stronghold, still is, and birds there are increasing. So it really leaves southeast Cornwall still to be recolonised. And I suspect that's a combination of the nest sites aren't quite right because the geology is not right, and it may also be a habitat issue. We had a bird at Rame Head for a while, but he moved on. But Rame is absolutely perfect habitat-wise. So, a few numbers. I'll try and go through this fairly quickly. This year, we had a record 54 pairs on territory. That included 16 new pairs. That compares to 41 pairs last year. We had 46 of those pairs make a breeding attempt, which is quite incredible. I think it was 32 last year. We had a minimum of 25 successful nests, which was only 2 more than last year, and a minimum of 71 chicks, which was only 5 more than last year. But that meant that we have around 200 Cornish birds currently, which is amazing. This is one of this year's chicks on the left, with, I think, the male. It's quite a big bird. That's really the only sex difference between choughs. The males are bigger. And you can see that the young bird has an orange bill and orange legs. When they're very newly fledged, the bill can be quite dark. And then as they get older, the bill and legs turn red like the adult. By this time of year, you can't really tell this year's chicks from existing adults. So a bit more detail on 2022. I've seen 2022 described as a split spring, which means March was warmer than April. And when I looked at the stats, our experienced pairs did well, and our young pairs didn't do so well. So we got birds that had bred last year, maybe got 1 or 2 chicks out, and you would have expected this year that they'd have fledged 3 or 4, but they didn't. They either failed or they only managed 1 chick. And it's my personal theory. I've got no scientific backup for this at all, but given that spring weather, it is possible that our young pairs, the inexperienced pairs, allowed their eggs or chicks to get chilled, which is why they weren't as productive as the experienced pairs who would have adapted their behaviour better to the weather. But having said that, we had our first chicks out at the end of May, which is usual. It was the same pairs as usual. And we had 3 pairs produce a maximum clutch of 5 chicks, which is amazing. And one of those did that for the 3rd year in a row, which is absolutely incredible. But you know, they must have a good site and a very good feeding area to be that productive. And this is the population trend. This is courtesy of the RSPB. Back in 2009, they sat down and said, you know, how are we going to predict the best case and the worst case? And they decided the worst case from 2009 would be absolutely flat, so no population increase at all. And then the best case would be an exponential increase. So those are the 2 green lines. The red line is the actual result. These are birds showing probable and confirmed breeding behaviour. So broadly speaking, did they build a nest? And as you can see, it looks very much like an exponential curve. Don't pay too much attention to the fact that the red line and the green line actually come close at the end. It's the shape of the curve that's important. It's exponential growth, which is fantastic. At some point, it is going to level out, but hopefully not for a few years yet. So just to sum up really, what's led to that incredible success? You can't underestimate the protection, the value of the protection given by the volunteers in those very early days. Thousands of volunteer hours, 24/7 nest protection on several nests. It was essential to allow the birds to re-establish, to spread from Lizard across to West Penwith and then up to the north coast near Newquay. So that was absolutely vital. And habitat. That's the reason they went extinct in the first place. They have to have short crop grass near a nest site. And you know, the RSPB's Chough project put a huge amount of work into making sure, with this huge support of landowners, land managers, farmers, that the habitat was there for the birds to expand into. And the last thing is actually overwinter survival. The overwinter survival of first-year birds has improved enormously. We now have about 2/3 of them surviving into their 2nd year, compared to about 1/3 originally. And what seems to be the reason for that is that as the population's grown, we now have winter roosts with young birds congregating. And it improves the, you know, if they're in a group, they're more resistant to predators, they can find food more easily, and they can find mates more easily. So that has made a big difference in recent years. And it's about joining up the dots. So if you look at this map, the dark dots are where chough are currently, and the paler dots are where they used to be. So you can see that pretty much all of the southwest coast path used to have chough at one point. The conservation aim is basically to allow the Cornish population to expand throughout Cornwall and into North Devon and South Devon, which makes it much easier to join up with the Welsh birds, the birds in Brittany, and even the birds in Ireland. You know, small isolated populations are at much bigger risk of going extinct, as we've seen. So how can you help? Well, please look out for chough in Cornwall. Email me your sightings. I do answer every email. So that's great, and that is really, really useful in helping us find where the birds are, particularly in breeding season, so we know when new nests are, and they can then be monitored and protected as necessary. If you have the time, then please consider becoming a National Trust or RSPB volunteer next spring. As we have more nests, we're going to need more volunteers. And chough are pretty tolerant of people. If you're out on the cliffs and you're lucky enough to find them, if you stand quietly or sit quietly, they will generally just carry on feeding, doing what they're doing. They won't be too bothered. But disturbance at a nest site is very different. They will abandon eggs, particularly, or chicks, if the nest site is disturbed. So please don't post photos with a recognisable nest site on it. Just to keep the birds safe. Egg collectors are still out there, as I say, even though, you know, disturbance is probably the biggest problem the birds face at the moment. But yeah, just think if, you know, could that be a nest site? And if you've got any doubt, then please don't post it on social media. And finally, just enjoy finding and watching these incredible birds. And I will leave you with this. There are 33 chough in that picture. That wasn't all of them, there were more. It's a winter roost. And the caption says it all. That's what conservation success looks like. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hilary. What a fantastic talk. And what a really nice note to end on. I remember seeing a flock of, I don't know if it's a flock or what the collective noun is, but a group of chough like that. Oh, what, sorry?
Chattering.
A chattering, okay. Yep. So a chattering of chough near Zenor summer or two ago, just like that, flying right over us on the cliffs, and it was absolutely amazing to see. So yeah, that's brilliant to see. Super. Well, thank you very much for that. Those of you that have been to one of these talks before will know the drill. But if you're new here, well, we'll open the floor up to questions now. So you can do this by either raising your hand or normally just popping something in the chat. So if you hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat function there. I'll just pop the email in the chat there, so that should now flash up for everyone. If you click on that, you can add your questions in there and we'll go through those. Equally, if you'd like to ask the question yourself, just say I'd like to ask a question in the chat, and we'll get you lined up. I'll get the ball rolling. So you mentioned there that there's always need for more volunteers and things like that.
Yeah.
What kinds of activities would a volunteer be doing with this project?
There's it splits into three kind of distinct activities. There's a small group of us that are nest finders. So we take the sightings that have been sent into the email, and we actually go out in the early part of the year. We're looking for new nest sites. We're looking for birds that have been seen, and it's, are they here? Have they got a nest site? Are they showing signs of breeding activity? Then there's nest monitoring, and to be a nest monitoring volunteer, you basically need to register as a volunteer with either National Trust or RSPB or both. And you will go out to a known nest site and just be asked to go make several visits during the breeding season and sit for an hour, a couple of hours, and observe what the birds are doing. And you're looking for breeding behaviours. So does it look like they're nest building? Are they flying in and out with twigs and things? Is the female incubating? So you're seeing one bird going in and out because the male feeds her while she's incubating. Does it look like they've got hatched chicks? And that's when you see both birds going in and out feeding the chicks. And then obviously the reward at the end is, do you see your chicks fledge? So that's monitoring. And then safeguarding is like monitoring, but it is more investment of time. And that's where you're at an nest site for anything up to a 4-hour watch. It doesn't have to be that long. But the idea there is that you're trying to prevent any disturbance to that nest site, which is usually people blundering past signs and, getting too close to the site. So most of the time you're not needed to do anything, but you might be called upon to ask someone politely, could they just move away?
Yeah. Do you find, are some of these nest sites fairly close to, say, the coast path or something like that?
Yeah, that's the problem. We have several that are close to the coast path. Our oldest bird, his nest site is very close to the coast path, and he has a habit of sitting on top of it and shouting at people.
as is his right to. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so that one is safeguarded.
Yeah.
Because of the disturbance. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Just looking in the chat, Roger, you were not wanting to ask a question.
Thank you, Ben, and Hilary. Thank you very much for such an informative and enjoyable talk. I've been scribbling away here, so I've been very fortunate to see chough in several places in Cornwall. Mm-hmm. But one of the main places has been near Treen, where there was quite a large winter roost, and indeed, I saw about 12 chough come into a garden to take food. Is that unusual for chough to go into gardens? And is there an age? Two-part question there. Is there an age at which chough will no longer gather as part of a winter roost?
Yeah. So it is unusual for chough to go into gardens. It doesn't happen often, and particularly with bird flu at the moment. We would encourage anyone who has a bird table that chough are visiting to make sure it is kept really, really clean. But they're intelligent. If there's a free lunch and they know there's a free lunch, they will take advantage of it. So in terms of your other question, will older birds join winter roosts or not? The winter roosts are primarily young birds. So birds that are not yet paired, birds that do not yet have a site. But in some cases, adult birds will join them. But generally, yes, it's unpaired and young birds.
Lovely. Thank you, Hilary.
Excellent. Question from Brian here. Have any Cornish birds been found outside of Cornwall? I guess it's be the ringed ones.
Not that we know of. None of our ring birds have ever been found outside Cornwall. The birds that are currently in South Devon might be ours, but they're all unringed, so we don't know for sure.
And did you say earlier most of the ringed ones are on the Lizard and West Penwith? Is that right? Yeah,
you will only, as far as I know, we have never had a ring bird north of Godrevy. So if you see a ring bird north of Godrevy, I'd really like to know, because it may not be one of ours. There are ring birds on Lizard, and most of them are in West Penwith. We've only got 28 ring birds at the moment that survive, and the majority of those are in West Penwith.
Great. That brings me on to another question, actually, in terms of when people are emailing you to report a sighting, what sort of details would you need? Obviously, so if there's a ring, that's great to know.
Yeah, it's ideally what I'd like to know is where did you see it? So a grid reference, ideally, because that's how we hold the data. I can work back from a grid reference to a grid reference if you give me a what 3 words or a GPS, but ideally I prefer grid reference. But yeah, anything that locates where you saw the birds. If you saw them doing something interesting, so like picking twigs up off the cliff or grass in March, that's nest building. So anything like that is really useful. If you see chough with youngsters as well, that's also useful because it helps us track where the parents are taking their chicks. And I should have said as part of the presentation that this year, the numbers I gave for chicks fledged and successful pairs were minimums because we had birds turning up in odd places with chicks in tow. And we really weren't sure if they were pairs we'd missed or if they were pairs we knew about that had just gone on a very long day trip. So that's important. But generally, yeah, it's just where were they? How many did you see? And were they doing anything interesting?
Brilliant. Okay, good to know. So I've got another question here from Brian, which is, what's the theoretical maximum population for Cornwall, if we know it?
I don't know that. I mean, when you look at that, the map, I mean, they were spread through most of the county, North Devon and South Devon.
Habitat is maintained.
You know, my rough guess, it's significantly more than we have now, because if the habitat's there and the sites are there, there's no reason why they can't. I suspect at the moment the reason they're not spreading into southern and eastern part of Cornwall is the habitat's not there. You know, I say it is at Rame, but I think between Lizard and Rame, you know, there's not many places where the habitat is right, just because of the geology and the way the coast is.
Yeah. So even if there was, I don't actually know how much sort of grazing goes on along that bit. Even if that's in place, it probably wouldn't still be that impactful. Okay, that's interesting.
But they were there at one point. You know, they were there a few hundred years ago. So, you know, the sites must have been there then.
Yes, I guess there's fewer. Certainly, just thinking from the bits I've been to, over the water from Falmouth, between there and St Austell, there's not as many cliffs as you might find in West Penwith, for example. It's a bit more slopey and open.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, the granite is brilliant for them because it naturally cracks and joints.
Yes,
so you know, there's lots of natural nest sites in granite, but you know, once you're into Killis, it's soft and crumbly, and yeah, it's just not as good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they're making plenty of headway in other places, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
Another question here from Brian: Do they interact with other corvids?
Yes. They're most commonly seen with jackdaw, but that's just because jackdaw also nest in holes on the cliff. So you'll often see chough kind of loosely associated with jackdaw. They have an interesting relationship with jackdaw. I've seen chough stealing nest material out of a jackdaw's nest and flying off with it with the jackdaws in hot pursuit. That was a young chough. He didn't really know what he was doing, but it certainly annoyed the jackdaw. I have had a report of chough that this year that failed. I suspect they lost their chicks, they got cold, going and beating up their local jackdaw. But generally they coexist with the jackdaw. They don't like crows. They will go and bomb up crows. The male pair that I talked about, we saw them, bear in mind, they're not, you know, they were not breeding. They were holding territory, but they were not breeding. And they just went and attacked a crow because they could. They can outfly a crow.
Right. Are they more quicker, more agile?
Yeah, and they just went and gave this crow a hard time. They hate ravens. Ravens probably their biggest predator.
Really?
We know we've lost several broods of chough to raven. I've seen it. You know, we were doing nest protection at a particular site, and the raven came around the cliff, hotly pursued by both chough parents. The chicks were probably a week old, and the raven went straight into their nest site. Nothing they could do.
Yeah.
And it was too late. That, you know, chough have one brood. If they lose eggs, they can sometimes lay again. But once they've got to that stage with chicks, it was too late. You know, biologically, they're just not capable. They can only breed for a very limited time period, and then it's too late. So yeah, they lost their chance that year, and they actually moved site.
Right.
Because the raven knew where that nest site was, so they changed.
Yes. Well, at least they're adaptable in that sense, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, they don't like crows. They definitely don't like ravens, and they tolerate the jackdaw.
Interesting relationships there. Roger, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thank you again, Ben. Thank you, Hilary. Further to the conversation that you had before that about the Roseland Peninsula and along that way, there's quite a lot of agricultural land. There might even be quite a lot of disturbance from visitor footfall. But I have noticed when I've been out on the boats along the Roseland Peninsula, I've noted a lot of peregrines. Now, when I say a lot, I mean, I don't mean a huge number. I just wondered, is the peregrine equally a reason why choughs might stay away from certain sites in Cornwall?
No. I mean, peregrine, probably after raven, is probably the next biggest predator of chough, but our coastal peregrines in Cornwall are in deep trouble. There are fewer of them, and they're not breeding. But you know, that's a completely different issue. But no, chough will nest close to peregrines. When chough nests were being watched 24/7, the peregrine nest that was in the same zone as the chough actually fledged chicks for the first time in a couple of years, presumably because they were being watched and protected, because the choughs were. The downside of that was that the chough chicks were ringed, as they were, and then a couple of weeks later the ringer went into the peregrine nest to ring the peregrine chicks and found all the chough rings. Yeah, so fledgling chough are a target because they can't fly that well, and they were just too close, so the adult peregrines would have seen them as easy prey. But no, generally they coexist. They just don't like peregrines. As I say, they will go and bomb them up. They think they can outfly them, and some of the time that works. But yeah, we've had one or two chough corpses picked up with a lot of leg damage, and it is probably because they've tangled with peregrines, because they present claw to claw, so their legs get raked.
Okay, thank you, Hilary.
Do we have any other questions? We don't have any more in the chat at the moment. I have one more myself. Oh, Pamela, I can see you've got your hand up there.
Yes. What effect, if any, that you can tell, has the dry period early this year had on the choughs feeding?
As far as we can tell, they seem to have survived okay. We were worried because the cliffs got very, very dry. But actually what they did was they moved inland. When it was really hot and dry, we were not seeing them on the cliffs at all. You know, we're in touch with each other as chough volunteers, and none of us were seeing birds on the cliffs. But we were getting the odd report of chough feeding in ploughed fields. Because obviously, the ground had been ploughed, so it was soft. And as soon as it rained, as soon as the ground got a bit softer again, they're back on the cliffs.
Good.
So I think they were just intelligent enough to shift, but we were worried, particularly with the young birds. You know, would they know, or would they just kind of carry on the cliffs and not find any food? But yeah, they seem to be okay.
Thank you.
That's good to hear. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I will wrap things up with one last question then. We sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but you mentioned there's now 200 Cornish choughs, which is great to hear. Are there any, I guess, targets or just hopes for the future of just how much they might continue to grow, or is it just a wait and see, doing our best to see what happens?
Yeah, I think if you go back to that RSPB graph, the one with the green line and the red line, the green line was kind of in our wildest dreams that might happen. That was the exponential growth. We've got exponential growth. For how long that continues, we don't know. It will level out. It has to level out at some point. But we know that even in places like West Penwith that have quite a high chough population, there's plenty of habitat. There are still nest sites, although they will start to use less advantageous nest sites, because obviously the pairs currently in possession have got the best ones. But there is still so much of Cornwall that they could recolonise. You know, there's the entire stretch from the Camel up to Bude and then to Heartland. And a lot of that coast is good habitat. You know, it's just a question of all the nest sites there. But, you know, they were there a few hundred years ago, so no reason why not. So yeah, we don't really know. I think we've kind of reached the limit of what was even dreamed about back in 2009. The thing we are going to have to watch is bird flu. It is a small risk to chough. You know, it's mainly in seabirds and gulls at the moment, but you know, there is that theoretical possibility that it could jump into things like chough. We know it's been found in ravens, but they're carrion eaters, which chough aren't. So, you know, they're at much lower risk because of that. So it's not considered a serious risk, but it is something that it's there at the moment as a possibility. But assuming that all goes well, then, you know, 100 chicks fledged next year is not unreasonable. I'm not saying that's a target or anything, but, you know, given how many we had this year and how many more pairs we might expect next year, it's looking possible. But the habitat is key. The habitat is absolutely key. You know, if the efforts that are being done at the moment by farmers, landowners, if they stop and the cliffs go back to scrub, we will lose them again.
Yeah, but it sounds like there's a very good dialogue between everyone at the National Trust and everything else on that front.
Yeah, there is. And so the National Trust are, you know, they are doing huge amounts of work, you know, with the land they have on the cliffs. And it's not specifically for chough, I should stress that. It is general conservation, biodiversity, but, you know, the choughs are definitely benefiting from it.
Well, that's great to see, and I think very nicely summed up by your last slide on here as well. It's so nice to have a good news local conservation story in Cornwall.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there aren't many.
No,
there aren't many,
exactly.
It is one. Yeah.
So we should absolutely celebrate the ones we do have. So to finish, it's a cafe side tradition. I'll ask you all to unmute in a minute, and in a second we'll all just do a little round of applause for Hilary and a fantastic talk today. So thank you very much, Hilary, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
You're very welcome.